How was the skiing?
Yeah, it was all right. So I'm calling from my hotel room in Garmisch in Germany because I was here for my company's offsite. And yeah, we had a good time, had some good meetings, had time to go skiing as well. Have you ever been in Garmisch?
Skiing in Garmisch. I don't think I have, no, but I've heard really good things from people who have gone. So
So they do this New Year's run down a slope in Garmisch, and they do like these crazy jumps. So we did that slope like 4 times. It's actually
nice.
super nice, and the views were really nice. However, it was very, very cold.
Okay,
It was like
okay.
minus 20 degrees.
Oh, really?
So really, yeah,
That's really cold
yeah,
for skiing.
approaching approaching the temperatures that we were talking about in a previous episode.
Not,
Not
I don't,
quite.
not quite the coldest places on the universe, but definitely getting somewhere for any normal standards for sure.
How are you? How's things there? You're back in London. You're in our house.
Yes, exactly. I got back on Friday, so back in London, calling in from London. All good, all set up here, getting ready for the work week next week. So, you know how it is. It's weather-wise, it's not the same. It's not quite minus 20. But yeah, it's a good weather, I'd say. It's nice and sunny and cold at the same time. So that's
That's a pleasant
quite.
surprise
Yes,
from London,
indeed.
of all places.
It is. It is indeed.
Okay, well, welcome back, everybody, to Two Words, the podcast with my friend Dan Hartley and myself, Juan, where we talk at the intersection of economics, finance, business, technology, you name it, every topic that we are interested in. Dan, how are you doing today?
Good, good. Doing very well. Excited to record this podcast, record another exciting session. I think we have some very interesting topics lined up. I think in some ways also building on our last session as well, which I find is quite nice in some regards. And yeah, just looking forward to it really, Juan. How about you? How are you feeling?
Yeah, well, a lot has happened since we filmed that first podcast. Well, for starters, we started the channel. We started all of our channels where we distribute the content. You can now listen on Spotify as well. We're taking some clips on and posting them on TikTok and on Instagram. So follow us on our socials if you're listening. But yeah, one of those things that happened last week actually was that, at least from my side, I received very good feedback from people I know that listen to the podcast. So yeah, that's always motivating to continue to do this. I don't know, Dan, if you heard any feedback from anyone that listened to the podcast.
Yeah, no, I heard a lot of feedback, and I think we had quite a. I mean, I saw earlier today we're at 150 views on YouTube for the first podcast, so that's a good start. I think we're at 600 views on TikTok for some of our reels, so it's going in the right direction. And from friends, got some really nice feedback. So super nice. I wasn't expecting as many people to tune in and listen to two guys in London talking about the topics that interest them. But I'm very positively surprised, and I'm really happy we're doing this. And that's why I'm excited to also dive in, really.
Yeah, why don't we dive in? Actually, the first topic that we wanted to touch on is an article that I read in The Economist a few days ago. It was actually posted quite a while ago now, like a few weeks ago, still in 2024. And it was around young people abandoning their dreams. So the main point of the article goes like this. In the 70s, at Ivy League universities, apparently 1 in 20 people went into consulting or finance. And that number is up to actually 1 in 2 in 2024. And so the article quotes that more than ever before, life on campus feels like a fast track to the corporate world. And so I wanted to first touch on this point. I think myself, I can use as a case in point here. For anyone that doesn't know, I went to university to study aerospace engineering. And then after my training there, I decided that engineering wasn't really for me. It wasn't the career that I was expecting. And I decided to move, and I'm now working as a management consultant. So I took it somewhat personal, and I used the opportunity to reflect myself on what may have triggered that. And I also wanted to hear your opinion, Dan, on, the state of the educational system and why people could be moving into finance and consulting roles at the very, top universities.
No, I thought it was very interesting, and it was very interesting you brought it up because definitely it's something that sparks, especially with I think our group of friends, the people we're surrounded by, the people we went to university with, ambitious, hard workers. A lot of people have ended up in those fields, and there has been a natural tendency towards those areas. And I saw that article as well. I didn't actually read it, but it came up over and over again as advertising on some of my social media platforms, and so it's quite interesting also that, as like a bit of a tangent, but that it's targeting people like us. I think in terms of their algorithm to look at those sorts of articles. But I think one of the main things is I would say that there is a huge amount of financial pressures that haven't been an issue if you think about the 1970s, and that leads to a general tendency of risk aversion, and therefore a movement towards people going for stability and security, despite those jobs maybe not necessarily aligning as much with their values or what they could imagine a future, right? Or spark their creativity. But also something interesting I read was something about parents and the impact parents have in terms of these decisions, especially nowadays, if you're going to university. But I think really the main thing is that element of stability, and we can break that down further. In terms of inflation, wage rises, the rise of student debt. I think those are some of the key points that we can touch on. But what are your thoughts?
So I think that in a way you're right, but I think it's a two-sided coin here. There's on one side the financial pressures for sure that makes people want to go into higher paying jobs, and lately engineering roles do not satisfy those ambitions financially for new graduates. But then there's another element which is arguably even more important, which is the career path that some of these engineering companies are offering that is falling slightly behind other jobs like the consulting industry or finance jobs, high finance, investment banking, which offers a much more structured career path where you can clearly see your route for development. But then also, so personally, now I am speaking for myself. When I went to university and I studied aerospace engineering, for anyone wondering, it was almost forced upon us that we were studying aerospace engineering, and then there were only a few options that we could go in, and those were either Airbus or Boeing or one of these big corporations in the aeronautical industry, or Formula One. I think even 40% of my degree ended up going into Formula One. And that is a very different type of career path, because in the end, you're going into a motorsport instead of a business, really. And then on top, the experience that I had and what I could see before making my mind that I wanted to go into business, then there's, of course, personal choices where I was very into business economics, and one of the reasons why I decided to study aerospace engineering was purely because I liked it. And if I had to select again, I would probably do it all over again because I really, really enjoyed the degree and the actual units. And I knew that my passion for business, economics, finance, I could always pursue in the longer term and self-teach myself in a way where with engineering, it was much more difficult to train those skills. So I'm actually quite glad that I'm seeing now companies like the Teslas of the world and the big tech companies that are offering a much more structured career path, and a career path where you can actually be creative and ambitious and grow within the firm. Because my experience from looking at engineering roles, and again, there's nothing wrong with wanting to go into a regular 9 to 5. You're really into engineering. You're a really technical person. There's nothing wrong by going into an engineering firm and designing, parts in CAD and having a much more slow, in a way, less creative role. But as ambitious and entrepreneurial people, I think some of those engineering firms were really putting the lights off for those bright entrepreneurial people that wanted to go into engineering because they wanted to invent new things, and they faced a reality which is that you're just another cog in the machine that is actually quite mechanized. Every step of the process is already defined, and you're going to sit at your desk and you're going to do your parts in CAD and you're going to do X, Y, Z analysis, and that's it. So that is personally why I decided to go into consulting instead, because I had an interest in business and I wanted to have a much more clear, structured career path. Also, not being a hypocrite, it was clear that it was better financially as a decision as well. So yeah, that was personally my choice for going into consulting instead.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I see your point, in terms of giving yourself the creativity, the right environment to drive, to work hard, drive change, which might be lacking in some roles and some organizations. Uh, I wouldn't necessarily say that is always a bad thing, though, in terms of the structure, right? Having structures in place, you need structures. Let's say you created your own startup tomorrow, structures around how you use your time, how you develop a product, are all really important steps to consider in running a business. Of course, there are extremes, and you could argue that most corporates have this problem where a lot of time is wasted in this concept of a 9 to 5, right? So either people are spending time on tasks that they shouldn't be doing, or don't finish tasks because they work 9 to 5, sort of thing, right? So I do see your point there. And when you become such a small cog in such a big machine, it becomes quite difficult to actually see what you're doing. And I think that will also generally drive a general lack of motivation, which might impact your sense of value, sense of achievement in the engineering example. I think to me it was more a holistic piece of, if I think about, I guess I'm coming more from the perspective of, let's say you're an arty person, right? So you studied English literature and art. You read that at a very good uni. Um, well, you might be interested in becoming a working at an art dealership or something like that, right? Or in a museum. But I think a lot of people are feeling now a general pressure into these higher paying jobs with a sense of stability and clear career path, because I think that also falls into it, Juan, that if you can see where the career is going, then that gives you also comfort in why you've applied in the first place. And I think something that was very interesting to see is I saw that so the millennials and Gen Z are often found to be more risk averse compared to other generations we've seen. So in Barclays report published in 2022 revealed that 62% of Gen Z felt financial security was more important than pursuing a passion-based career. And so that comes to my point again about, student debt, housing costs, cost of living that we've seen in the UK, but that's not just the UK, right? In particular, I'd say the UK and the US, when we're talking about that article, are some of the key countries where really that financial instability has become a very big thing. And I think I also saw an article about how that's leading to less entrepreneurship, right? So if you are somebody who thinks creatively, who wants to build, change the world, let's assume you did a PhD at Cambridge, for example, and you then go for a high paying corporate job, even though you know that intellectually and maybe even resources wise, because of your connections, you might be able to do so, right? With a whatever your PhD was on, right? So I think that's quite an interesting thing to look at, and I think particularly focusing more on the more holistic piece of people who studied art, right? Their starting salaries are around 20 and 25,000, whilst in finance and consulting, it's 40 to 50,000 according to the graduate market in 2023. So there is a big discrepancy. I mean, we're talking about double the salary, right? It's quite a big delta, and I think you've seen that, right? In terms of wage increases have not been anywhere near as much as inflation increases, which means that people's purchasing power is reduced. So there's been a lot more pressure on people. House prices continue to rise, cost of living continues to increase. So it's a very interesting discussion. And as we know, in London, it's even more severe, which is, 1 in 6 people in the UK live in London, for example. And so we can apply that same philosophy to a higher extreme in a place like New York or other big cities that exist in the States. So I think that's also the way I see it. But I totally also agree with the points you've made. I think it's more a depending on the individual person, right?
Yeah, so actually, that's something that we shouldn't forget, and it's that, every person is different, and I've met people throughout my life, and especially at university and at my degree specifically, that are, very competent, very intelligent people that really decided to go with a career in engineering because that was completely their passion, and they didn't care so much about the financial aspect about it. Now, engineering, out of all of the career options, is arguably not the lowest paying job. So,
Not at all, not at all.
not that we have to compare everything to engineering. But then, yeah. So going back to me personally, I do consider myself somewhat of an entrepreneur, and I wanted to go into a firm that was entrepreneurial and that I knew was going to give me those responsibilities and allowed me to pursue my interest in business, in how businesses operate, coming from a technical background, but then also keep being entrepreneurial within the firm as well. So, personal choices are obviously very important here. But then getting into, so you actually talked about the UK and the US, and personally coming from Spain, that actually sparked a thought from a conversation that I had a few days ago, where I was sitting at dinner, and on the right I had the CEO of my company, and on the left I had one of the directors of the London office, who is actually Greek. And the CEO of my company asked us, guys, we were talking about an Italian firm and how it is to work with the Italians. And then he said, "Oh, guys, you're Mediterranean as well. What would it take for you guys to go back to your countries?" And that actually gave me some food for thought. Immediately, my head went to, from my firsthand experience, but then also from what I hear about others that I trust, is that there's a much higher proportion of people that don't have the drive or the passion to excel at their work in Spain compared to the UK. And we'll get later into how this, I feel, is also evolving in the UK and why I think it is worrying. But in Spain, I think that it is very much a cultural issue. That people are very problem oriented, and especially that they're problem oriented without any sort of accountability. Now I'm generalizing, of course, but that is what I observed compared to the UK. It's this mentality of, this doesn't work, there's a problem, and it's someone else's problem. It's not my problem at all. And the CEO of my company was saying that actually that's also how it works in Italy, but then on top, the Italians will lie at your face and say that everything's working and they won't touch anything. And then when you go in, you uncover that things are not working properly. And actually, the Greek director, on the contrary, said that Greece in particular is much more hierarchical than the UK. And he said, I would go back to Greece when I can be at the top of the pyramid, because then I will be able to push the right culture down from the top. And then I was there thinking, and I was trying to picture how that would look. And I was saying to myself, no, this wouldn't work, because it is very much a cultural issue. And so it's a bit of the rotten apple analogy, where you have a basket of apples, and no matter if you're at the top of the pyramid and trying to really push that culture down in the organization, the moment that you have a rotten apple, it's going to spread and it's going to rot the rest of the basket. So that's why the recruitment process in a company is very, very important. But then also identifying those rotten apples early and getting rid of them, preventing the rot to spread to your highest performing apples, is also very important. And I was there thinking, okay, what is the root cause that is causing in these Mediterranean countries? And here I can really talk in particular about Spain. What is the root cause that is making up this cultural malfunction in society, where people really see the business and the company as the ultimate enemy? And that is it. Unfortunately, that culture is much more embedded in society in countries like Spain, and it is completely a cultural problem. It's that the media and everything now is super politicized, especially in Spain. From the left, you're seeing the push of the narrative of entrepreneur versus employee, and paradoxically, the business is seen as the ultimate evil that is the enemy of the employee, although it is the one who pays the employee's wage. And unfortunately, now I think we're seeing that virus spread to the UK, where the country actually has seen one of the largest exodus of successful people, successful entrepreneurs in the world in 2024. If I remember the stat correctly, it's 9,500 millionaires left the UK in 2024, which is more than double than the previous year, and second only to China, where the population is around 20 times the size of the UK. So unless we really tackle that problem from the root, and we push a completely different narrative down to the population, that it is okay to be ambitious, it is okay to make money, it is okay to work for your employer to make money, to give you opportunities to then improve personally, professionally, but then also grow. I think that's the only way, if we succeed in doing that, that I would see myself going back to a country like Spain.
Right. That's very interesting, Juan. I mean, I find your rotten apple analogy quite interesting. I take it one step further in the sense of I think it's you know how there's the saying that you are the five people who you spend the most time with, right? So if you're surrounded by five athletes, you'll become athletic, sort of thing. And I think that there's an element there as well because, I mean, don't get me wrong, if you have sunny beaches and access to as many olives as you want on the beach every day of the year, I can understand why, in comparison to a place which is super rainy and cold, and so you stay indoors all day and you don't know what to do with your time, so you end up working, for example, it can naturally lead to a cultural difference, and therefore you have a deep underlying cultural change and difference. That goes back, well, centuries, right? And it becomes part of weather, it becomes part of people's culture, and it becomes so many other aspects. Now, you could always argue that if you look at the US in comparison to Europe, you might in California have just as good weather, for example, as Spain, and then that gets a bit more complex to understand why. Why is California so entrepreneurial and so many people work so hard in the US in comparison to Europe? But I think overall, I generally speaking agree with your point. I think it isn't an easy thing to solve because you're talking about a deep rooted culture and there might be other elements at play in terms of why are people taking a more left view? Is it that the economy isn't growing as strongly as it used to and therefore people are worried about their jobs? So taking a more protectionist view. Our tendencies are more capitalist as well, right? In terms of our roles, our jobs. So I think those are also important things to consider.
Yeah, so actually, yeah, there are many more things at play here. And it's interesting that you bring the economical part up here as well, because it is true that, yes, the economy is not going as great as people would have expected. We also have an inverted population pyramid. And in states like Spain, that causes a major, major concern with the way that the pension system works. And ultimately, I think you can almost boil it down to one aspect, and it's that countries in Europe, but not only in Europe, now you're seeing it become a great problem in the US as well. Countries are already running on a massive deficit, and their populations are supporting highly socialist, highly inflationary policy. And that inflation is almost always pushed down to the lower classes because the people that can actually profit and benefit from inflation are the wealthy. And that ultimately, paradoxically, creates even more wealth inequality. That's always been the case. So yes, there is an economic aspect to it. And there might even be an educational root cause aspect about it as well, now that I think about it. That is also one of the key reasons why I decided to leave Spain even before starting to work and going into university. So actually, let me just go on a short tangent about this, and then we can get back in. I also want to get your views, but I know we have a lot more to speak about. I just find this also a very interesting point to make. One of the key reasons why I left Spain was because of the education system. And I think that fundamentally the way that the education system is set up in Spain already is turning the lights off for very ambitious, bright children, where we are not teaching creativity. We are creating machines of memorizing and regurgitating and spitting back into a sheet of paper. That is it's incredible to me that the education system has barely evolved in the last 150 years, where technology and the real world have evolved so much. And it's just amazing to me that, you know, okay, in a subject like history, I understand that you have to memorize things. And now here's my engineering rant, of course. Dan, you won't believe how much we had to study, memorize, regurgitate, spit on a piece of paper, and 2 days later forget about everything. So you obviously stay with the holistic story, but I was forced to memorize the dates. And I'm talking about the actual day, the month, and the year, somewhere in the 1600s, where a particular treaty was signed. And I'm going to take it one step further as well, because even in subjects that you would expect to be more, how should I put it, giving you the tools to solve a problem, like, for example, mathematics, problem solving, teaching you how to be analytical. So subjects like math, like physics, like chemistry, I would argue that they weren't teaching you how to be creative and solve a problem. They were still teaching you exactly how to solve a particular type of problem that you would memorize, do 100 times, go on the exam, and yes, you would have 5 parameters, and one time it would ask you to find parameter A, and sometimes it would ask you to find parameter C and give you all the rest. And you would have to use the same formula, just inverted, maybe. But that's it. It's a different form of memorizing. So it wasn't really doing what it should, in my opinion, do, which is teaching your children how to use a set of tools to then face novel problems, which is exactly how the world works. You're not going to find a problem that is in the real world exactly how you've expected it to be, exactly how you've studied it to be, and that you can just apply a simple formula and get the right answer. That's just not how the world works. And I knew that the British system was much more project-based, much more real-life, solution-based. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to move to the UK, and not only to the UK, but also to a university like the University of Bath, which was famous for, at least in my degree, and now I'm happy to hear your view as well, Dan, being much more project-based. Now, Dan, you have gone through several education systems. I don't know if you share my view, but it would be awesome for the audience also to know your experience on this side.
Absolutely, Juan. So I think I'll try and break it down into the two major parts, which are the university aspect, which I agree with you, and I'll get into that later. And then the first part, which is the education system, I think primary, secondary, high school, which I went through an international school system, but based in Germany, and I had elements of a German schooling as well. So I did see a combination of those two. And I would argue that it's probably very similar from what I've gathered to the Spanish system, to the French, to the German. And the reason why is what I've read a little bit about this, which is so the modern schooling system that we know today, that is used in most countries around the world, originally comes from the Victorian era, like you said, and basically it was created during the Industrial Revolution when you had factory workers. So it was focused on giving people an education level to do repetitive tasks in a factory environment to an extent, right? I'm not talking about higher education. So a huge amount of focus there has been on getting people to stick in line, do what they're told, sort of mentality. and it's worked, right? In terms of back then, you could argue that they should have updated the system. A lot of things happened, you know, 2 world wars. So I think maybe it wasn't necessarily the focus point as well. I also think that there've been a lot of debates about the best schooling system, and some you have these random schools which try new things. Um, but the reality is, I don't think anybody's found the right conclusion, and they've thought, well, this is good enough in terms of getting people's brains stimulated, getting their memory stimulated, getting their ability to follow instructions, which prepares the majority of the population to follow rules. But in terms of your point, right, of how the world works, how to create value to society, how the world has changed so significantly, the importance of technology, and the fact that a large aspect of this, you're still doing, to a lot of schools, you're doing exams on pen and paper. Why are we using pen and paper when every single professional, well, most professionals don't use pen and paper unless it's required as a fundamental reason in their job.
That's a great point.
I find even those small things, you know, I find that personally frustrating, and I know that personally, when I have kids one day, I won't rely on the education system that's put in place because I don't think it shows you how the world works. And the reality is, I think only after going to university and after university, you really start understanding how the world works. Because it kind of feels like you've been in a small puddle or a lake with a with some floaties to help you float, and then suddenly you're dropped in the massive ocean, and you can't see land, and you don't know where to go. You don't know, you know, if you're gonna sink, if you're gonna swim. Just kind of, it's quite sometimes disorienting, and I think that means that there's a gap that needs to be filled in that regard. But I agree on the point on university. I think the UK, and in particular the universities who focused on bridging that gap a bit more. So, for example, at university, we also had a lot of project-based work, working in group assignments, both assigned or you chose the groups, really reflects the reality of the work. Placement years, right? So a lot of universities in the UK focus on getting people to experience new cultures through going abroad or through internships or 6 month, 12-month placements. I think that's really, really good use of people's education and time at a young age to explore, to understand the world as part of their degree rather than just jumping in with both eyes closed, right? I don't think, me personally, I did a year in banking. I understood that industry a bit more. I realized the things I liked and disliked, and it really helped me inform how the world worked and how different it was to the education system we knew before that. Something very interesting I also find, which is the focus on the UK on getting in. So you have to really, there's some tight restrictions in terms of being accepted to a university, and then the expectation is that you finish within 3, 4 years, or five, depending on masters or bachelors. Whilst in a lot of other European countries, you that there's a very different filtering process where a lot more applicants can be accepted by the universities, and then they, on average, the career paths take longer, right? So a bachelor's can take 5 years in Germany, for example. And that comes to your point about productivity as well, is the US and the UK have always focused on as short as possible university experience. And I think the compound effect of 2, 3 more years later on can really be a big difference, because you might have learned things at a way earlier life point, right? You might have realized you want to be an entrepreneur 2 years earlier, which means you weren't married and had kids, for example, right? And those sorts of things can really impact your overall career and life choices. So I do agree, and I think that's one of the reasons I came to the UK as well, is kind of get it done, keep going, sort of thing.
Well, Dan, let me just share a very interesting anecdote that you have just sparked in me, which I think demonstrates that the admission system for university in Spain is fundamentally broken. The way that it works in Spain is that you have a global test. It's a bit like the A levels, where you do some mandatory tests and then some optional tests. So personally, I think I took chemistry and physics as the optional subjects, and then everyone has to take some core subjects like Spanish language, English, math, and history, I think are the four. And then based on your grades, which again are just exams that you study to heart, word by word, and then if you're lucky, the exact topic that you've studied comes up in the exam, and you just have to write an entire essay that is literally word by word what you've studied the week before. And based on those exams, then you get a grade. And based on that grade, you're literally just turned into a number. There's no personal statement, no essay, no interview, no nothing like there is in the UK with the the UCAS system. You're literally turned into a number, and then based on that number, you can apply to whatever course you want in any university, public university in Spain. The way that it works in Spain is slightly different, but the best universities in Spain are state funded. And, if there's 100 places and 300 people have applied for that particular course, then the 100 people that have the highest grades get into the course. Well, I already knew by the time that I had to apply to university in Spain that I was going to go to Bath. I was already accepted. I had reached my grades, but I knew, I think I even had the accommodation paid for, so I completely knew that I was going there. So I said, okay, well, I'll just apply because, you have to do it. And I went online and I actually got accepted into medicine in Spain. And I hadn't even studied biology. I had zero interest in medicine. And for anyone wondering, because I didn't turn up, it would have gone to the next person. So I didn't take anyone's place. But it just goes to show that if I really wanted, I could have taken the place for someone that really has the vocation to go into medicine, that has really studied medicine, that really wants to go to medicine, but maybe wasn't as good as me memorizing a set of dates, historical dates, and putting them on a piece of paper, which you tell me how that impacts a doctor's ability to save lives.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think there's a huge component there of, on one side you're trying to test somebody's psychometrics, like how much knowledge can they absorb, how much information that can they remember about all the bones in the body and all the different diseases and all the rest of it, which can be a very important part for a doctor working on the spot, which fair enough. But there's so many other aspects, right? I mean, the best people in sports, they didn't get great because just they had maybe some genetic advantage. It's because, Michael Jordan did a lot more hours in the gym training. Muhammad Ali ran 5K every single day and trained like crazy. You know, a, there's a huge element of people being passionate and actually really going for what they're interested in. It also, just on a side note, it's really interesting you mentioned that, because in Germany, actually, I'd say it's the opposite. So medicine is one of the toughest uh, subjects to get into, but I'd say roughly everything else is quite easy. Like the thresholds are much lower.
Actually, in Spain, it's similar, where the barrier to entry to medicine. I think there's a few other degrees like maths and physics, or like some of these double degrees that you have in Spain are also you need high grades. But especially the reason why I was mentioning medicine and the fact that I got into medicine is just goes to show that the Spanish admission system is broken, is because, yes, medicine is one of the hardest degrees to get into. And the fact that me, that had zero interest in medicine, I barely know the bones in my body. I didn't study any biology, and I don't have a passion for medicine. The fact that I was able to get into medicine just because I was good at memorizing dates on a history exam, or I was good at English, or I was good at, I don't know, physics, which has nothing to do with medicine. And the fact that I could have, if I had stayed, taken a place from someone that was really passionate, to me, it's just bananas.
Does not,
It's
yeah, it does not make
bonkers. It
sense.
just does not make any sense. But anyway, let's move on from this topic, because a few days ago, the World Economic Forum report for the future of jobs in 2025 just dropped, literally a few days ago. And it was very interesting. And I just want to share some of the takeaways from that report with you, Dan. Holistically, it said that 170 million jobs will be created in the next decade, and 92 million jobs will be displaced. It was interesting to also see, what types of jobs are growing and which ones are declining. And there's where I got really surprised. And now I would take all of this with a pinch of salt, because in the end, it's, again, trying to predict the future. I'm not saying that their study is not founded, but it said that, yes, in percentage terms, jobs related to new technologies are growing fast. So any jobs like AI, data science, fintech, engineering, those are growing fast in terms of percentage. But in absolute terms, it was quite unexpected. And it says that the top largest growing jobs are actually going to be farm workers, laborers, and other agricultural workers, light truck or delivery service drivers, software and application developers. That was less of a surprise to me. Then in fourth place, building farmers, finishers, and related trades workers. And in fifth place, shop salespersons, which again was a bit less of a surprise. And then on the top largest declining jobs, we have at number one, cashiers and ticket clerks. An obvious case for that. Second, administrative assistants and executive secretaries. Again, no surprise there. 3, building caretakers, cleaners, and housekeepers. I was surprised to see that one when you have number 1 and 2 on the left there really as the largest growing jobs. But anyway, maybe it's so we shouldn't forget that it's the year of the robot, so anything could happen, I guess. But yeah, so Dan, I was really surprised by number 1 and 2 there. So farm workers, laborers, and other agricultural workers. And then second, light truck or delivery service drivers as the, in absolute terms, top largest growing jobs. I think that the first one is related to the fact that the transition into a greener economy is making people go back to the countryside and back to basics, growing crops, etc. Although I would have expected some of the technological trends to push that down. However, here I think is where you see the length of the cycles of the adoption of new technologies as well reflected on this report. But for me, one of the key takeaways is that it said in the report that employers expect 39% of key skills required in the job market to change by 2030. So that means that an unprecedented event will have to take place in the next few years, and that is the reskilling of the existing workforce. And I think that that is going to be one of the greatest challenges that I think humanity has seen, because you're talking about 2030 is not that far anymore. We're in 2025, so the fact that almost 40% of the skills required will change in the next 5 years, that means that you're going to have a very, very open-minded workforce and have a massive reskilling plan that I see very difficult to achieve, and it is almost scary, having talked about all that we've covered before as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Juan. I think it's a great one to bring up. I think just off the top of my mind, I think there are a few things that lead to that list. I think the first one is you kind of touched on is this the technology revolution, and I'd say in terms of an unprecedented event of change or technology change, I think the whole AI topic that we've already covered really actually has to do with disrupting people's workforce by 40%. I can see that being a fundamental truth, that people's jobs so change so significantly. If in theory you become 20 to 30% more effective or more efficient with your job with AI enhancements, that means that effectively you're changing 20 to 30% of your role, right? And so that must be linked to that statistic. I think in terms of the top jobs and the diminishing jobs, I think there's already technologies like the cashiers that we know of in London where self-checkouts, and you've realized that the value creation is quite low, and there's a tendency of millennials and Gen Z to trust technology more. So rather than us wanting, I notice it personally, I've seen an article about this, that we trust technology more. So instead of going to a cashier who might get something wrong on your order, you'd rather scan the products yourself and pay for it yourself at the self-checkout counter. So that makes sense to me. On the point on similar jobs you might think of that are being added, right? And you're like, wait, those two things don't make sense because agriculture and going to the supermarket, they seem like the same job. I think that's more driven by a general macro trend of population growth. I think that has to do with the fact that we have more mouths to feed. I don't think it has a significant aspect to do with, people trying to now genetically modify food sources, or suddenly everybody eating greener. So now lettuce demand has increased by 40%. I think it's more that sort of trend. And then the last one, I think, which I'd like to touch on a little more, is you mentioned also the decline in caretaking. And I think that's quite an interesting one to focus on, and people taking care of houses. I think there are two things that could be at play there. And I think the first one is people's disposable income. We know, right? If your purchasing power is reducing, then people are unable to afford the luxuries of having a cleaner, for example, or a caretaker. And that applies to businesses, that applies to people. So I think that's the main thing. And we've seen that, right, since 2008, real income has reduced by 10% if you incorporate inflation and wage increases in the UK. And you've seen a similar decrease, 9% in the US, and that applies across a variety of other countries. So I think that's a really important aspect to consider in some of these statistics. But I think at a wider scale, I think the important thing is also to highlight something that's not being spoken about here, is the types of changes we're going to see in terms of the importance of some of those jobs. I've heard and I've seen articles about, with AI, lawyers, accountants, high engineers, architects, all sorts of high paying jobs, marketeers, are going to be quote unquote replaced, right? And we've discussed this a bit at length in terms of replacing people, and it's not quite how it works with AI, but to an extent, some of these growth in, let's call it more primitives, working types of jobs rather than white collar jobs, I think also shows you that we're going to see a shift towards the types of what's considered importance in society, and that's going to be quite an interesting one because a construction worker, despite us having robots, I think you'll find that people are quite important in construction work, and I think you've already seen it in the north of the UK. It's some of the most attractive professions are electricians and plumbers and construction workers because they earn so much more money than a white collar job because there's so few of them. And so I think we'll see a big trend in terms of some of those skills, actually, some of those hard labor skills, which is a very different change to kind of the way the world currently operates, and the way that we currently think about the world as what is a good job, what is a bad job. But there's a general big gap between the two professions, and you'll see let's say maybe a 20% increase in the salaries of those individuals, but it still won't have closed the gap of the difference in skills. But my point is more that you will see a general influx and importance increase for something that I think currently might be seen as quote unquote less important of a job.
Yeah, no, Dan, I agree 100% with you. And this only reinforces the point that we were trying to make earlier, whereby, in these uncertain times, so we're now talking all the time about AI and technology, but any type of technology, the rate of advancement of technology currently is so high that we don't know what the world is going to look like, not even 20 years from now, but 5 years from now, right? And I think that it's even more relevant to educate yourself. And if I was even a parent and trying to figure out what I could suggest my children to go into, it's this notion of problem solving. It's more important than ever to go into educational fields that really teach you how to solve problems. You don't know what those problems will be, but you have to have that analytical mindset, that mentality of, there's a problem and I have the tools, or I even don't have the tools. Let me go find the tools to be able to solve this problem. And especially with AI, I was here in Germany giving a keynote speech at my company about the implementation of AI, somewhat of a double hat of mine, let's say. I would approach it slightly differently from how you phrased it. I don't think AI is here to replace jobs. It's here to replace people that don't use artificial intelligence and really any technology trend, which is what's happened in the past, the previous 100 years. It's nothing novel. It's just you now have to be able to adapt to AI. But previously you had to be able to adapt to the internet. And even before that, to adapt to a laptop, right? And I really think that AI is not going to be used as a replacement of human labor, but in fact as an enabler for those individuals to focus on high value or higher value activities. I would like to go into this last point that we had in the agenda, and actually maybe you can take the lead here, where there was this Goldman Sachs report about the economic outlook for 2025, and I think you maybe have a few ideas.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Juan. So just finishing on your previous point, I think I agree with what you said, and maybe it was a poor choice of words on my side, but I agree, especially, right? It's not here to replace people, but it's an enabler, and it will replace the people who, in terms of AI, it will replace the people who don't use it. That leads us quite nicely to this topic, where the reality is we don't know. Like you said, we can predict, we can forecast what the next 5 years will look like, what jobs will grow, what jobs will decline, and I thought it'd be interesting to touch on that. And considering all of the pressures that we've spoken about, especially for our generation, touching on it more from the perspective of, well, what could you put your money behind that you might be saving every month, um, or thinking about, or thinking about the investment side of things, and arguably a good reason to listen to this podcast or educate yourself more on where the world is going, because it might impact you financially for a good reason. And yeah, so it was really interesting. So one of my friends sent me this report, and it effectively is a summary of the outlook of 2025 by Goldman Sachs. And it talks about a few different things to think about. So there's a huge focus on the US economy, as it's the strongest economy in the world, the most productive workforce, the lowest state in terms of GDP per capita in the US has a higher GDP per capita than Germany, which is the economic powerhouse of Europe. So there's a huge focus there and how it's performed and thinking about next year. So, in the US, we saw that the GDP increased by 1.4 trillion in 2024, China at 937 billion, the Eurozone at 619 billion. And so something to understand is what's driving that 1.4 trillion. And that's where, us talking a bit about people's culture, people's approach, what do they care about? Are people, going into these high paying jobs? Are they becoming entrepreneurs? These all things actually lead into that actual number. So we see that actually high productivity is the main driver. So there was a 2.3% increase in productivity. So people are generating more money in the US per person than before, right? So it doesn't mean that it's driven by a population growth that might be the case in India or China. It's predominantly by focusing on making more money either through new technologies, innovation, or squeezing out more money out of the existing businesses. And it's a combination of the two. It's focused, it's actually driven mainly by technological leadership, so tech companies, the whole AI focus. So that's really interesting. And one of the ways to measure it is the S&P 500. So for those listening, the S&P 500 is an index, which is effectively a variety of stocks and shares in the US economy. It's the top 500 companies at any given moment in time in terms of the best performing companies, and how that's measured is in terms of their size. And what we saw was that if you took an index based on the size of each company and you put in a little bit of money in all 500, following a certain method, how much money would you gain or lose? And that's a good metric of the US economy, and it's also a very good investment tactic for those who are interested in stocks and shares. And we actually saw that the S&P 500 returned 25% in 2024, which is really, really high. So from an investment side, there was a very, very strong development in the stocks market. Non-US developed equities returned 4%, emerging market equities 8%. So that is really, really demonstrating how resilient the US market is on a global scale, and the global dominance in terms of the companies the US has that are listed in the US, but also how strong it is and how influential it is around pushing forward humans, right? I mean, the whole AI revolution, the whole focus on some of the topics we've discussed before, like quantum, but everything in between, just normal, your everyday food delivery services or shopping. There's so many different aspects that the US economy has a really, really powerful presence within. And what's interesting is that since the global financial crisis of 2008, the US has actually significantly outperformed the rest of the world. So it's not just a measure of this year. And the reason I mentioned that is because that's what's expected in the future. So the US economy is expected to continue to grow, continue to be super strong, and has shown that it's got long-term favorable returns. So if somebody's listening interested in stocks, it's worth looking at the US economy, and that's the view of seasoned professionals. And something that they also mentioned, which you listeners might know, is the debt situation, because the Western world operates on a debt model. Since the Second World War, what they've done is effectively taken out huge amounts of debt and, similar to a private equity firm, then stuck it into the economy to drive the economy forwards and therefore create tax returns, create wealth, create consumption. And that's where the idea of credit cards comes from, mortgages, and just generally driving businesses through debt and the creation of debt. And that's been a strategy used by developed markets for a very long time, and it's gotten increasingly higher debt levels to the point now that the US is at 99% of its GDP, which people are a bit worried about, because it's like, wait a minute, how does that work? You'll never be able to pay that off in theory. Where
Unless, and here is some of the theories around debt, is if you are able to really grow the US economy, and I think this is also in Donald Trump's words now, if you're able to grow the US economy over, by 30%, then all of a sudden you're underlevered, as opposed
exactly,
to overlevered, right?
exactly, Juan.
Let me just make a note here, because it is very important as well to think. And here I don't know which data you've looked at, Dan, but it's very important to consider this factor of debt when looking at GDP growth, because if you are putting on debt and generating a deficit, below the line, and you're growing the economy above the line, then yes, in a way, no wonder you're having this immense stimulus like the US has had in the past few years, especially with the COVID bills that were passed by the Biden administration. Then you have some accounting tricks that make the comparison misleading. Now, overall, I agree. The US has grown, and the S&P 500 has grown, and overall, the US has outperformed other markets, especially Europe. Again, we touched on it in the previous episode, but I bring it back here. Europe historically has been known by being very good engineers, having very good engineering companies. Again, especially cars in Germany, that was the engine of the European Union. Now you're seeing those companies have some headwinds coming from China, especially. Also, manufactured goods companies. We talked about the European Union being a net exporter of goods, but the reality is that Europe has missed the technological revolution, starting with the software as a service revolution, but now even with all of the AI technologies that have been developed. Can you, Dan, name one big technological firm that can compete with the likes of Apple, the likes of Google, Meta, now even Tesla with their software in Europe? There are none. And it is a bit linked to what we were saying at the beginning with Europe pushing out entrepreneurship. But then also, I just playing devil's advocate, and Dan, I really want to hear your opinion on this again, because you are the finance wizard out of the two. I'm only an aerospace engineer. I before going into this call, I just briefly checked the price to earnings ratio on the S&P 500, and I saw that it has, and maybe we can pull up a chart as well. I saw that it has only been higher in three moments in recent history, and those are the dot-com bubble, the 2008 financial crisis, and during the COVID pandemic, which, okay, the earnings were lower because there was no business. I understand. So maybe for people to understand, at least this is how I view it, maybe with a bit more of a Warren Buffett style. And also Warren Buffett is putting together a big cash position, so that maybe is also relevant. And again, happy to hear your views on this. But for me, fundamentally, a business can be valued by the future cash flows that it will generate in the future, discounted back to the present, right? So maybe we can explain it a bit further for the audience. And the only reason that I can find for why the price to earnings ratio on the S&P 500 is so high at the moment is because the market is pricing in a boost in productivity partially derived from the AI revolution that in theory should boost the earnings of companies in the future, meaning that although the price is expensive compared to today's earnings, it will be cheap compared to tomorrow's earnings, and the market is being bullish at the moment, which is also a slight concern, because if it turns out that AI companies don't find a way to return the massive amounts of investment that has gone into building the foundational infrastructure, like we said in the previous episode, then, and it turns out that it's an AI bubble, like people are calling it. I wouldn't call it a bubble, it's fundamentally different in my view, but then it is concerning because we could see not a recession, but a drop in the price of the S&P 500. And okay, yes, it's at all-time highs this year, so it's bound to see a correction. But yeah, Dan, so maybe you could explain all of this a bit further for the audience to understand.
Yeah, no, definitely, Juan, and very, very good points. So, first of all, I think for the audience, for anybody who doesn't know, or just as a recap, price to earnings ratio refers to the currently traded share price versus how much you would, as a shareholder, would get for having one of those shares. So, let's assume a share price of 300 and you'd get $30 back after a financial year, would mean that your price to earnings ratio would be 10, and effectively that means that's the number of years that it would take to get back your initial investment, or also known as payback period. And so that gives you an indication of the overall optimism in the future of a company. Like Juan rightly said, it basically refers to the fact that if you have a very high price to earnings ratio, it means that the company is expected to deliver a lot more earnings in the future, and or people are happy to have their money with that company because they feel secure with having those investments, and therefore the price to earnings ratio goes up because of market dynamics of low supply, high demand. Now, the thing with the S&P 500 is, Juan is right in saying that a lot of it has to do with people's optimism about where earnings will go. And one of the main things to also keep in mind is, because these are publicly traded markets, they're all knowing. So as soon as big AI companies are releasing their new updates, that is, in theory, right? There's the debate between perfect markets versus non-perfect markets. But that knowledge is publicly available, and so in theory, that should be reflected in the share price. And the same applies to big changes in companies, earnings developments. And so in theory, those things, you do notice it on results or big news announcements, how that impacts the share price. And so, yes, I agree with what Juan's saying. I think there's also an element of the Trump administration and an optimism there in terms of the economic boost of the US, bringing Trump in and his economic policies, which has generally speaking, boosted the S&P 500. Now, the price to earnings ratio being high can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing, depending on the reasons behind it and what we will see develop in the future. One thing to consider is that, and it's also discussed in the Goldman Sachs report, is the S&P 500 has historically returned 7.5%. Because of such a strong few years, it's now increased to 9% in the last, whatever, 70 years. And so we would expect a market correction, right? It is not normal to have 25% in one year. So therefore you would expect a decline at some point of some sorts. And that might be because some of those AI promises won't be delivered. It might be driven by macroeconomics, but just in terms of taking a more behavioral view. But that doesn't mean that the US isn't a strong economy and that the US isn't where you should put your money in terms of what the recommendations are as a young person, because it's still going to do better than other economies, and in the long run it might go down by 10% this year, but it might, and then it continues to go up by 200% over the next 8-9 years in terms of the cumulative effect, right? So in that's where I'm coming from in terms of the discussion on the economy and thinking about where to put your, if you had some, if you're interested in the stock market and investing. So that's where I would focus.
Okay, well, thank you. I really enjoyed this finance corner. I hope
No
the
worries.
audience also enjoyed it as well. Why don't we close the episode with the same exercise that we started in episode one, which is trying to select the two words of the week, or the two words of the conversation today. Dan, what would you pick as your two words?
I think my main word would be change and optimism. So I think from our discussion today, I think there's a big focus in the next few years on change in terms of the skills needed for young workers, young white collar workers, thinking about the future. But I don't think it's a negative thing. I think it's quite a exciting thing. It's about learning skills on AI. I think it's learning about some of these interesting changes that we're seeing in terms of agricultural work becoming important, and generally speaking, a focus on optimistic change. I'd like to see that, including myself, including similar people to ourselves. I think, it's great to have an entrepreneurial mindset and to drive that in businesses, or to go and try things, take risks, try something new. I think those are the things that might scare people, especially with what we talked about regarding security. And I think that's something that hopefully as a generation we can move out of, and seeing some optimism around the world going forward.
I would also like to reference back to our initial discussion about the training of the population and where people want to see themselves working. And my two words of the week for me then would be entrepreneurial adaptability, because I think that's, especially the word adaptability, is what we need our workforce to be really ready for. And we just need more entrepreneurs, really. We need more people that are willing to innovate, ready to solve problems, and ready to advance the state of the art on whichever field that may be. And that might very well be engineering, business, or creative arts. So here's your call to action. Please, whatever you do, do it with an entrepreneurial mindset and do it with entrepreneurial drive, and try to aspire to make the world a better place for younger generations in general.
I think that's a perfect way to leave the episode, Juan. leave some food
Yeah.
for thought. Hopefully, we hear some comments about people's new entrepreneurial adventures.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. I have to go. Great tuning in. And thank you for everyone that's listening. Again, if you've reached this far in the episode, please drop a comment below. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Thanks, Juan.